Oh, but Mandy, I'm an emotional eater. That is something that I read on a very regular basis in my DMs on all my social media platforms. But I don't actually like it when someone creates an identity for themselves around something that they do or around something that they struggle with. If you start off by just rephrasing it to, I am a human, I am a person, and I have emotions. And when I'm emotional, I tend to turn to food as a coping mechanism. Already, there's such a massive shift when it comes to your mindset. Because now you are removing the labels from yourself. You are breaking that identity that you have created for yourself. Welcome to this episode of the Mandy Meyer podcast. As per usual, this is the podcast where we chat all about your health and fat loss and your goals when it comes to your health and fat loss expedition. Oh, and how you can achieve those goals. Before we get into today's episode of this podcast, just a friendly reminder that I'm opening intake to new members for my private group coaching program this Sunday and Monday, the 30th and the 31st of March. There is a link in the description where you can go read all about it. Now, back to the emotional eating. I will reiterate this. You are not an emotional eater. You are a human who eats as a coping mechanism when you are emotional or when you are stressed. And when you break it up like that, it is allowing you are allowing yourself to create a change because you have separated the two entities. Here's the harsh reality that not a lot of people want to hear, or maybe you have heard it, but you haven't accepted it yet. You were not born an emotional eater. Eating as a coping mechanism to deal with your emotions has become very habitual over the years. And what that means is, over the years, you have been turning to food as a coping mechanism when you've been emotional or stressed or dealing with something difficult. And every time you've turned to food to find comfort, it has become more and more and more of a habit. And like I said, that's exactly what it is. It is a habit that has been created over the years. Now, that shouldn't be something that scares you, because if it's a habit, it means that you can break that habit and create a new habit. But here's the secret. You have to be willing to want to do that. You have to be willing to want to find other coping mechanisms or ways of dealing with your emotions other than turning to food. I have done many podcast episodes, even a YouTube video on a strategy called the if-then strategy. That would be an excellent strategy for you to start working on. If you get emotional, then you will turn to X, Y, and Z instead of turning to food as a coping mechanism. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the if-then strategy, purely because I have discussed it through several different episodes and videos. In short, what it is if you get emotional, what do you currently do? If you get emotional, then you turn to food. Now you want to change that then. If you get emotional, then you will phone a friend. Or if you get emotional, then you will go for a walk. And essentially all it's doing is getting you to create a new habit as opposed to turning to your old habit, which is food. Many of you might not have heard this before, but every time you ask a runner, why do you run? A lot of the times their answer is, I run because I want to run away from my problems. The reason why I mention that is because a runner might turn to running as a coping mechanism. And for them, going for a run when they are emotional, upset, stressed, most likely would have become very habitual over time as well. But we don't see runners going around labeling themselves as, I'm an emotional runner. Here's the thing, there's no magical overnight secret or strategy that you can use to stop turning to food as a coping mechanism, purely because it is habitual and it's a habit that you've potentially created over years. It's going to take a long time for you to start breaking that habit and possibly replacing it with a habit that aligns with your health and fat loss goals. Here's another thing, and it's very important. You have to be willing to want to change. You have to be willing to want to implement new habits. You have to be willing to want to turn to something else in that moment when you are emotional. And yes, I know it's not easy. Yes, I know it is a struggle. Yes, I know it is damn difficult. And I also know that breaking habits take a very long time. I know that creating new habits take a long time as well. But you have to do the work daily. And here's the reality of it. It is going to require discipline. It is going to require control. It is going to require willpower. That moment where you feel super emotional, your first instinct will be to grab that box of biscuits. In that moment, it will require you to be super mindful and ask yourself, what can I turn to instead of these biscuits? Again, every time someone slides into my DM saying that they are an emotional eater, it's followed by them expecting to change it overnight with some magical quick fix. That is not going to happen. You have to start implementing different thens. If you get emotional, go for a walk. If you get stressed, phone a friend. If you are upset, journal about it. And you have to practice these things over and over and over and over again. And here's me calling a spade a spade. If you know that you are using food as a coping mechanism for certain things, leave the temptations at the shop. You are making it even tougher for yourself by bringing those temptations into your house. And if it's your partner bringing those temptations into your house, explain to them why it's so important that those temptations stay at the shop. And another thing, a very big thing, is you need to figure out the root cause of your emotions, the root cause of your stress. Because it doesn't help that you just keep ignoring the things that are making you emotional or the things that are making you stressed. You actively need to go out there and start working on these things and working on managing your stress and managing your emotions so that you don't always feel like you need a coping mechanism. And I totally get it. Food in that moment is making you feel better. It's giving you that feeling of comfort. I get it. I've been there. There are still days that I visit that little piece of comfort. But one thing that I've learned over the years is turning to food for comfort is such a short-term solution. Because in that moment, whilst you're feeling upset or whilst you're emotional or whilst you are stressed, you get an instant feeling of relief or an instant feeling of comfort. But it's not very long-lived. Why is that? Well, that's because you are putting a band-aid on a wound that needs stitches. So again, it's easy to label yourself as an emotional eater. But number one, that is just a label. Don't create an identity for yourself. And number two, you have to actively start making a change. And that starts by you wanting to make a change. And wanting to make that change and starting to make that change will really see that you start looking for other coping mechanisms and that you start practicing self-control, discipline, and willpower. Again, I know it's not easy. I know it is difficult. I know it is a struggle. But here's the important thing. You are in control, not your emotions, not your stress. You are in control. And if you don't start breaking that cycle bit by bit, then that cycle is never going to end. And I've said this before and I'll say it over and over again. If you are struggling with something that is making you emotional, whether it's something present or something in the past, or maybe it's even something in the future that is stressing you out or making you upset or emotional, you don't have to go through it alone. There are so many professionals out there who you can go to seek help and advice, who you can go to chat to and talk to and open up to about the things that are making you emotional and stressed. The problem is people don't speak openly about therapy or seeking help. And it still has such a stigma around it, but there's absolutely no reason for that. And I can tell you now, as someone who used to bottle up absolutely everything, and as someone that was always afraid to open up and speak about any of my struggles or emotions or anything like that, I can tell you now, once I started speaking out about things, once I started opening up to people, once I'd been to therapy, making smaller changes seemed far more doable and far more easier. And just remember, you're not an emotional eater. You are a human and you tend to eat more food when you are emotional. That's it. I just don't like labels because labels make it very difficult for someone to change because you've tied yourself to that label. So it's very difficult to separate away from it. On that note, I'm going to love and leave you like I usually do. Keep smiling, keep laughing, and keep being kind to one another. Much love, your friend who used to have horrible coping mechanisms, but not so much anymore, Mandy.